Hello, mentors. Welcome to our podcast series, Mentorships in Education, brought to you by Just Education at justeducationfirst.com. I am your host, Judith Epstein. I am very excited about the wide range of experts who have volunteered to give up their time and expertise. They will share their innovative ideas, their exciting perspectives, their rich resources, and their research with us. Please continue to delve into these topics on their websites and with your legal counsel, healthcare provider, and education professional. Our guests will have information that will be relevant to mentors supporting struggling students, parents, teachers, administrators, legal support, and health professionals. We will address all levels of education with issues that affect academic performance. Our goal is to open discussions and introduce a variety of approaches to those searching for information in a free venue. So mentors, let me introduce our guest for today. Welcome, mentors. This is our 29th podcast. I am so excited. We're really moving along with so many giving, wonderful professionals who are volunteering their time to help me make a dream come true, which is develop a free resource for parents and educators and mentors of children for a foundation of information and help them in their discovery process. I've learned so much from each guest. As a teacher myself, I've lived through many of these things, but one subject became a concern to me as I began to do research on it. And our guest today is going to help me understand better the struggles of the gifted learner. Sometimes we don't pay attention to that. We feel these kids are bright, they'll make it through, they don't really need any support. And the reality is that gifted learners have their own struggles in their own ways. And I hope that our guest today, Dr. Charlton Wolfgang, is going to help us understand a little bit better what some of those struggles might be and how we as mentors might be able to support them through this. Welcome so much, Doctor. So nice to have you with me today. Before we get to chatting, I do want to tell our listeners a little bit about you. And if I forget anything, please feel free to chime in. Dr. Wolfgang is an associate professor of gifted education and STEM education at Millersville University in Millersville, Pennsylvania. He's the coordinator of a master's in education and graduate certificate in gifted education and the Gifted Endorsement, which, as I was reading this, kind of popped up in my head. I've never heard that term before. And is this, just tangentially, is this something new that you developed that isn't really yet out there, this endorsement for gifted teaching?
Well, first, I'd like to say thank you, Judy, for this opportunity to come on your podcast. It's quite an honor.
Thank you.
I hope it comes through as we have our conversation that this is an area that I'm very, very passionate about for a variety of reasons. So I wanted to put that out there first. In response to your question about the endorsement, in our particular state, there's no certification in gifted education.
Oh, okay.
So the endorsement is kind of a step in that direction, something that many of us who advocate for gifted education have worked tirelessly for, I would say, for decades, long before I even became involved in gifted education, to try to get some kind of formal training for both regular education as well as gifted support teachers to be able to better meet the needs of gifted learners. So that's what the endorsement is. It's a credential that's approved by our Department of Education, saying they have at least a minimum competency in meeting the needs of these learners.
Okay. There's more that I want to share with our listeners, and I want to mention, as always, that the full bio will be on the website, and people are certainly welcome to go and listen to that either on the website or on the podcast itself, wherever they get podcasts. But you work with teachers, who are working with students in early childhood and mid-level education, in gifted education, in science methods and STEM education. Dr. Wolfgang taught middle school life science, middle school gifted support, and high school honors biology for over 17 years, and served as a curriculum and instruction consultant for STEM at the local and intermediate unit. He served on the board of the Pennsylvania Association for Gifted Education for 10 years and focused across the board and in different components of the community to help support that. He was selected in 2017 as the Outstanding Educator of the Year by the Pennsylvania Association for Gifted Education, which is called PAGE. And he continues to do advocacy work for gifted learners and working with educators in training of pre-service and in-service teachers. So I think we have the right person with us today to learn a little bit about this. And when we spoke before, one of the issues that certainly intrigued me when I was writing my notes was your personal experience at school as a gifted learner, because you are a gifted learner. So not only are you talking about gifted learners as students that you have observed, but you are talking about the real life experiences that you have had and the challenges that you have faced with your parents in addressing this. So can you talk a little bit about this as you know, from an educational standpoint, from your family dynamic standpoint, from a social dynamic that, you know, may have been a challenge to you at school? Break some of these different components in, and I'll be quiet and I want to let you talk.
Oh yeah, this is there's quite a bit here to unpack, but
Yes.
I'll try to make it brief. I do think that, and a question that, just let me preface this with a question that I would often get from prospective teachers of the gifted is, do you have to be a gifted learner yourself in order to teach gifted students? And I say absolutely not. You know, all it takes is a passion and a willingness to understand how these students learn and what their needs are to really be an effective teacher of the gifted. Now, having said that, for me, I always felt that it helped me to better understand some of the challenges that my students faced, because I did live through it and I struggled, you know, at times with really understanding who I was as a learner. And something that I've discovered over the years working with my students is that, and I'll touch on this later as well, it's really important for gifted learners to be able to understand why they learn the way they do and who they are as learners. And that's something that I think I struggled with as a child. I was a kind of a young kindergartner. It was a midsummer birthday, but when I was tested, well, later on, my mother told me that I had the highest scores of any of the students that were tested that year. But my parents were concerned because I was immature, being a boy, being a very active child. They were concerned about me being able to really focus in school, and that was a challenge for me. I was never diagnosed with ADHD or anything like that, but even to this day, I do struggle sometimes with focus because my mind's going in a variety of different directions and I'm thinking a lot of different things. And I think that was a challenge for me as a young learner in school. And I know that manifested itself sometimes in misbehavior. And
really? I never would have thought.
And for me, one of the biggest struggles on my report card, and this tells you how old I am, was we had a category there, works and plays harmoniously with others. And as a young, probably 5-6-year-old, I learned what the term harmoniously means, because I always received a negative in that one. That because of my choices and my undeveloped frontal lobe, I shouldn't say always, but I often made poor choices in school. So I'm sure that I was a challenge for my teachers and for my parents. My mother was an educator and then a stay-at-home mom once the three of us came along. So she tried her best, and I think she did an exceptional job of trying to enrich our learning at home. as well. And to add a little more context to that, my father, who I believe was a gifted learner himself, never went to college. He was, was a blue collar worker, worked very hard, and but that was his generation, how they did it. His parents never went to college; they didn't finish high school, and for him, education was secondary to going out into the workforce, getting a job, supporting the family.
You talk about some of your struggles. One of them was focus. I'm wondering if focus had anything to do with your perception, perhaps, of some of the learning, and you were bored. Maybe the teacher was going over it 4 times for some of the kids in the class, and like you had it 10 minutes ago, or that's from an academic, point of view, focus, or did focus have anything to do with maybe trying to elicit the acceptance of some of the kids in the room? Were you ever bullied by the kids? Were you ever made fun of by the kids? And so maybe being, say socially immature, maybe being a bit of a cut up gave you an outlet for connecting with some of these kids. I mean, this may not be true at all, but I'm just wondering if that's one of the, how it might have worked for you.
All of those are factors that we certainly do see in gifted learners. And for me, thank you for asking those questions. Those are really good ones. The boredom piece, and that's something that my mother early on had talked to my teachers about, because I was an early reader. I read, I think, before kindergarten, as I recall. So when we would go over some of the basics, some of the mechanics of reading, those kinds of things, or even the content, I tended to absorb that information fairly readily. And I was a very inquisitive child. Curiosity tends to be one of the characteristics that we often do see in gifted learners, kind of that insatiable thirst for knowledge. And I had that in spades, I would say. And so that was a challenge sometimes when teachers would, like you had indicated, give us assignments that I felt weren't the appropriate pace for me. And I was told this by my mother and as well, that that was something that the teachers would bring up, that I wasn't always paying attention to what I should be paying attention to, because there are other things in the room that I felt were more interesting, or, as you indicated, I would create diversions for myself that would often involve my classmates. One of my favorite things that I remember, and I'm embarrassed to admit, was that I was one of those.
I like that.
But it helped me to understand, especially my middle school students, was I was the student who I could get the ball rolling, like initiate things, and then sit back and then watch other students take it and then get in trouble. So I was an instigator, I think, is the best way of describing that.
Yeah.
And that teachers don't appreciate that. And I understand why, as I was a teacher for many years, but I was that student that would really sort of instigate things and then sit back and watch the fun unfold. And that was obviously that I said, that's why I would say I spent all those years in middle school as penance for what I put all of my teachers through all of those years.
So as a middle school teacher then, you were very cognizant of the dynamics of the classroom with respect to the kids who had learning struggles, either at one end of the spectrum because they were gifted and for a variety of reasons, and at the other end of the spectrum, kids who are really challenged by the materials or the expectations of the academic protocols. You said that your parents kind of, they were aware of this and they did support you. How did they support you? What were some of the things that they did? I mean, were you punished when you caused this trouble at school? Was your mother understanding? Did she go to school and advocate for you? How did they support you?
I would say overall they were very supportive. My mother much more so than my father. He was the traditional, we live in Pennsylvania, and you may be familiar with the Pennsylvania Dutch. I come from a German background, And so my father was the quintessential Pennsylvania Dutch, Pennsylvania German father. He worked, he disciplined, and he's obviously changed in the years since then and become much more mellow. But as a child, he was a very intimidating figure to me. So my mother was the nurturer, and because of her background in education, she was very interested in trying to challenge and enrich us at home. So she did that. And as I had mentioned earlier, summertime was not just free play. There was a lot of that, and that was a wonderful opportunity. And I advocate that for every student to get outside, immerse themselves in nature, and just have that opportunity for free exploration. All children learn better that way. But she also did have very structured activities for us, educational extensions from what we were learning in schools. So we had a really distinct advantage, I think, because of her training. And also, she was a substitute teacher in my school. So so she was often in there. So she knew the administrators well. She knew the teachers quite well in my school. And she was actually a very beloved substitute for my peers. They really enjoyed my mother because she was very active. She'd bring in puppets. She was a puppeteer. So she was very, very creative, and she is to this day, even well into her 80s. Puppeteering has slowed down quite a bit, but she's still very creative. And so I feel like I inherited some of that creativity, not to the degree that she has by any means, but that is an excellent way to reach a variety of learners. So I did have that support from her, again, because of her personality as well as her training.
Now, the test that you took, I'm assuming, a while back, where she realized your intellectual gifts. Did she then discuss that with you and share with you, look, that my expectations are higher, my goals for you have evolved, or did she kind of let you develop on your own and not make a big deal about it?
It was I would say it was a combination of the two, actually. She did, as I recall, discuss it and told me what it meant early on. But I was fortunate that she never pushed me. Neither of my parents did. My father's overjoyed that I have a PhD. I mean, he loves to tell people, my son's a professor, because he never went to college, as I indicated, and he just thinks it's amazing. And I value that, and I really do appreciate that.
Do you know what we call a PhD? In my family, my son is also a PhD. Do you know what we call him?
No, I don't.
We call him a FUD.
And I've heard it pile it higher and deeper.
Right.
Is the PhD, which I'm sure you and your listeners have heard as well. Yeah. A FUD, I like that.
Yes, a FUD. My brother is a FUD and my son is a FUD.
So you're surrounded by FUDs.
I'm surrounded by FUDs. That's right.
So, and the reason that I bring up about, I didn't feel a lot of pressure from, they understood and they expected me to perform, but they also recognized that, there was more to me than just an academic machine or an intellectual machine. And I think that's one of the challenges, if I can maybe globalize that a bit, that we see with gifted learners. And maybe we'll touch on this later if we have an opportunity to talk about perfectionism and its origins as well as its impact on gifted learners. But many gifted students are in families where the expectations are very high, both internal as well as external expectations for them to perform. And that can be motivating for students, or it can be damaging. And students could really push back and rebel if they feel there's too many external pressures on them. We have in Gifted Ed what we consider hot housing of babies, and maybe you've heard of this, where when children are still in utero, parents are scrambling to try to get them onto the waiting list for the best preschools, because you get in the best preschool, you get in the best elementary school, the best middle and high school, and that'll take you on your path to Ivy League schools and to a successful career and life. That's a lot of pressure on a young child.
Yes, it is.
I always advocate a balance. High expectations are wonderful and are necessary, for success. However, there needs to be room in there for children to follow their passions and to be able to, really find out who they are, and they need that time for exploration. And that's difficult as a parent. If you have these goals for your child and you see them going off in a different direction, where you might say, okay, what's your backup plan? Because how are you going to make any money or make a living doing that? That can be really difficult for parents. But there really, I think, needs to be a balance of that support, that push for driving towards whatever, your goals are, and really balance those two items, I think, are so important.
So just to kind of back up and talk for just a minute, in terms of gifted students, you feel that it's important for gifted students to understand that they're gifted, and certainly for parents to have high expectations of them. But there also has to be an understanding that being gifted is not who they are. Being gifted is a component of their development of abilities, and exposing them and allowing them to grow in other areas is also important.
Right.
I would understand, if I'm understanding you correctly. The last time we spoke, you alluded to your original track being medicine, and that, after you got out of school, with your gift, your intellectual gift, you thought maybe going into medicine and becoming a doctor would be a great way to contribute to the world and to help people. And I call them aha moments. You had an aha moment that totally changed the trajectory of your goals, and helped you to reframe what your priorities were. Can you talk to me about that a little bit?
Yes, that was quite a journey, and reflecting back on it, I can certainly understand why I struggled at times with that decision, because I had no idea where I was going to go. I never in my wildest dreams envisioned someday being a university professor. That was not something that I aspired to, certainly at that point, or ever really imagined I would do. But when I was in undergrad, my degree was biology. Biology pre-med was the path that I was taking. I love science, and I still do to this day. A lot of the research that I work on with my students, as well as some of the instruction that I do, is in the sciences. But in fact, I was in undergrad, I was president of our medical society, the group of us that were going on to veterinary school or to med school. And I absolutely loved it. Took the MCATs, did well on those. But along that pathway, I was starting to really question whether or not that was the path that I wanted to proceed down. And I think, as I had mentioned in our previous conversation, and not to go all political on it, but I was concerned at that time about managed care and the HMOs, and just the impact that I thought that was going to have on medicine and the ability to practice medicine, rather than have to run a practice and the paperwork and everything else that it turns out a lot of doctors end up needing to do today. And I became a little bit disillusioned with that. And that was my own personal perspective. And I also, when I talked with practicing physicians at that time, or others that were planning to go into medicine, that was a real concern. And I'll leave it up to everyone else whether they feel that's how it's turned out or not. Yeah. But so then I struggled a bit, as gifted learners do. There's something that we call multi-potentiality in gifted, and that is that there are many different things that gifted learners, and all students, but in particular gifted learners, because they do tend to explore lots of different possibilities. So I struggle with what would I do? What would be the best career for me at that point? Because I had focused on medicine for so many years. And so I bounced around for a little while in retail and sales, and really just did not enjoy those things. I wasn't passionate about that. And as I had indicated, my mother was a teacher. My wife got an education degree, and we married right out of college, and she worked in a daycare for a year, and then got into a classroom and was teaching kindergarten learners. And she absolutely loved it. So more and more, as I saw what she was doing, and I was evaluating what it was that I wanted to do with my life, and I recognized that, I have this passion for science. Wouldn't it be great if I could turn that passion into helping others become passionate about science. So I wasn't totally abandoning medicine, because science is the core of that, but I felt maybe this is something that I could do. So I went back, got my teaching degree, and was fortunate enough to get a teaching job in middle school. I was planning to do high school, never thought about middle school, but absolutely loved it, and was able, which I know is unusual. A lot of people say I was crazy, but there's a certain group of us that absolutely love that age group, and I think it's because we never grew up, so we identify with those students, and so that really helped me to stay on that pathway for many, many years. And I like to say I never left that. I just have changed my focus, and now I'm helping others get excited about early and middle level education.
You talked to me about a special relationship with a biology teacher. I'm not sure where that came in. What was that about?
Right, and that was actually that was one of my college professors.
Okay.
Really, I just loved how he was a botany professor. And, a lot of people, animals are more exciting. If you're interested in bio, animals tend to be, because they tend to be mobile, they move, they interact much more so than plants. Plants respond to stimuli, but it's a little bit slower, typically, than we see in animals.
Watching grass grow is not really a lot of fun.
We have the saying, it's like watching grass grow. It's slow. But one of the things that I absolutely loved was the way that he made botany just so exciting and come alive. And that combined with the work that I did with our scanning electron microscope, being able to see the microscopic world at the nanoscale and really see the foundation for what we see, with our eyes as science and the interactions between organisms and their environment, really got me excited about that again. And I kept a number of different assignments that he gave us in anticipation of someday hoping that I could use these with my future students.
Great idea. We often think about the dropout rate. So many kids drop out of school. And I think I shared with you the population of kids that I've worked with over the years. I worked in lockup, I ran an in-house suspension room in the police station, I worked with kids who were remanded by the courts, I worked with street kids who were gang kids in our area. These were troubled kids, and the dropout rate was very high, but you kind of blew me away when you said that there are a lot of gifted kids that drop out of school. I never thought that in a million years. Tell us a little bit about that, and where you became aware of it, and what you feel what you're doing now might mitigate that.
Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah, and it is something that does tend to surprise people, and the numbers are very difficult to pin down. But a lot of the research that I have read has arrived at a number about 25% of high school dropouts would test in the gifted range, which is much higher than their represented population in the general population. We estimate, 2 to 10%, depending on how we identify, in the broader population would identify as gifted. So that's significantly higher than you would expect. And a lot of it goes back to a lack of fit between the educational environment and the needs of those students. And that's often what I try to tell teachers, either our pre-service teachers that are training to be teachers, or the teachers that we have in our graduate programs that are hoping to work more closely with the gifted population, is that it's really important for us to be able to figure out ways to adapt the learning environment to the learner. I think so often in education, we tend to focus on how we can adapt this learner to the environment, and that's the wrong approach. It really is looking at ways to differentiate the environment so that it better meets the needs of the learner. And that's difficult sometimes with gifted learners because of their ability to rapidly acquire information and to make those intuitive leaps. Sometimes they move much more quickly than we're really comfortable with the classroom being able to move. But I think that's one of the things that we really need to look at how can we adapt that environment? Because that will start, if we get kids in middle school, it's not too late, but it's getting close to being too late to really start to identify and support these students. Because what can happen with gifted learners is, they start to get really turned off to school because they feel like, and especially if they don't have a lot of like-minded peers in their peer group, they can really be turned off to education and what they view as education being very rigid, being very undifferentiated for them and not really being appropriate. So they'll look elsewhere for, meeting those needs, whether it's, outside of school, the behavior issues, whatever it might be. You can imagine, and those students then end up being really turned off to school, and it's a tragedy for those. Every individual student's a tragedy. It's also a tragedy for our educational system, because our goal as teachers, as educators, to meet the needs of every learner that we have, and I think that's an area that we really need to work on, doing a better job with meeting their needs.
So you're helping to create a program which, as I did, became certified in special education in Massachusetts. You're trying to create a program where teachers can become certified in teaching the gifted students. Would that be a comparable analogy?
Yes, very close. There's
okay.
still because there's no certification in our state in gifted. It's a parallel.
It's more a different terminology.
Right. Yeah, and I was just having a conversation this week with one of the grad assistants about that, which is why I do continue to bring that up. But you're right. It's the same idea: is to get them have this credential, have this expertise in that area, so they can better meet the needs of those students.
So, what kind of courses are your students taking, going through your program, which they would not have available to them in a standard education track to become a certified teacher? If they did, what are they picking up with you that they would be missing in a standard track to become a certified teacher?
Okay. And I'll talk about in two strands, the undergraduate and then the graduate, because I feel both of those are really important pieces there.
Okay.
For our undergraduate students, the pre-service ones, the students that are planning to become certified teachers, we currently have 2 courses that we offer. Both of them are electives, because there's just no room in there. Education, we pack it full of lots of great courses. So there's no room right now. We'd have to give something up in order to fit them into the required courses. We're working on it. We're not quite there yet. So they're elective. So the one of them is really, it's an overview, almost a survey course really of gifted learners. So we look at the social and emotional needs. We look at the characteristics of gifted learners. We look at how schools meet the needs of gifted learners. So there's a programming or gifted services sort of piece there to that. And then we drill down a bit more in the characteristics. So we focus on things like perfectionism, overexcitabilities, asynchronous development, those kinds of things that will help our future teachers to understand why the students are behaving the way that they are. They're maybe not trying to challenge the teacher or be a problem, as I indicated I had sometimes when I was a student. Mm-hmm. We want them to understand what's the core, what's the root cause of the behaviors they're seeing in the classroom. So that's that one course. And then the other one that I'm very excited about, that's more recent that we developed, is one, it's called Gifted in Pop Culture. And we use the context of television and film and popular media to help students recognize, what's accurate out there, which I can tell you not a whole lot, and what is inaccurate and what is really furthering stereotypes and myths that I think can do damage to gifted learners. And that's been a very, very popular course from students.
Perfect.
And that's open up to
segue.
That's open up to all students, not just education majors, because we feel it's an important course for all students to learn. Because believe it or not, gifted learners don't stop being gifted once they exit school. Once they go into the workforce, they are gifted adults, and there's whole areas of research that focus on the needs of gifted adults as well. And
do you incorporate your special group of courses that you've labeled to target gifted students? Do those somehow mesh with the special education courses? Because I would imagine that while gifted students are not considered special education students, they are special in some of the needs that they need, the support structure that they need to have that might, where they might benefit from some of the education from the special education courses. Is
Right.
is that accurately stated? I'm getting twisted with my words, but maybe you get what I'm trying to say.
Yes, I definitely get that. And that is an area of research that I'm very interested in. A colleague and I several years ago we sent out a survey to all of the institutions of higher ed within our state to find out, we looked at a couple of things. Were there any objectives within the special ed required courses to meet the needs of gifted learners? And we also looked at, are there any required courses for undergraduates in gifted education? And as you would imagine, there were very few universities that do that. And we don't have it as a requirement, as I said, partly because of some of the Department of Education requirements for teacher certification. But I can speak directly to our students. I would say about half of the students that sign up for the course or one or both courses are dually certified students that are pursuing both an early childhood degree as well as a degree in special education. And they've recognized that this is an area I will likely have students that have maybe more than one exceptionality. So I could have students that have a special ed, an IEP, but then they also might have a gifted identification. And we have many students that are like that. We call those 2E or twice exceptional. And so I'm very excited when our special ed students recognize that need. And so that's something that I'm very excited about. And some of my special ed colleagues do also integrate maybe an hour to 2 hours within a special ed course about gifted learners. But they do recognize that's an area that we certainly need to improve on, because special educators, you're right, the strategies that they use, many of those strategies work for gifted learners, and vice versa. Many of the strategies that have come out of gifted education we have discovered are very effective when working with regular ed as well as with students with special needs.
All right, I wrote a term down that you threw out before. I'm going to combine it with the term you just used, and you explain to me if they're related or not. Okay. You talked about 2E, twice exceptional. Mm-hmm. How does that, or does it, relate at all to this multi-potentiality that you mentioned before?
That's a great question. I've never been asked that question before.
Good.
Boy, I'll have to think about that. But I would say they are related there is some overlap between them. And that's something, boy, now you've got me thinking. See, this is that tangent. Right. Half of my mind now is going off on that one.
Well, my mind is too.
I'm going to write that one down because I want to look at that.
Maybe you can come up with some information on it, and we can, I'm familiar with the 2E, twice exceptional. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that has to do with a dual diagnosis. Is that correct?
It does, and we don't.
One of them being gifted.
Yes, and
okay.
I've also heard it called multi-exceptionality, because sometimes when we say dual or 2E, people assume that means they have one special ed identification and gifted, when obviously we know students can have multiple learning issues and learning needs that we need to make sure that we're supporting and identifying. But the idea is that they're identified as gifted, which some people can't understand. They don't believe that a student could be both gifted and have other learning needs. And surprise, surprise, students
where the term comorbid comes from.
Exactly.
And all of the the alphabet soup diagnoses that come with that. And you're right. We don't often think of gifted as being one of those diagnoses.
And it can, and those are and I think back, and I've worked directly with well over 1,000 gifted learners in my time, and I wrote GIEPs for every one of them, and so I most fondly remember a lot of them were 2E students because they were so complex. And you think about a middle schooler. First, middle school is challenging, as it is for anyone. You layer on top of that, they have special education learning needs. They have some sort of need that is preventing them from maybe being as successful as they otherwise could be in school. So they've got that. And then you layer on top of that the gifted identification and what that means as a learner, how they learn and who they are. And that's a lot for an adolescent to deal with.
Right.
And those were some, as I said, some of my most memorable students, just because they were so complex. And it was so much fun working with them to uncover all those different layers of who they were as learners. And, I can't say it was always easy. It certainly was not. As teaching any child can be challenging, but it was so rewarding to see the growth. And I would typically work with the students for 2 years. Our middle school was 7th and 8th grade. Just to see that growth over that time, beyond just the physical, which was always remarkable, just the social and the emotional growth that I would see in those students, and like to think I had a small part in helping them, really achieve that level of growth was really, really rewarding.
So I'm going to combine two other things that I've had time to think about since you and I have talked. And one is the development of an IEP. Mm-hmm. And that as it relates to a gifted child, because those are not usually combined, at least from my experience. And so I know that this is something that you've been working on, bringing this together. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you share with teachers and educators in this regard?
Sure. And it really varies, in the United States, because we have 50 different states that all have very different approaches to gifted education. Some fund gifted education, some mandate it but don't fund it, like my state. Some require GIEPs for gifted learners, which is the gifted, of course, individualized educational plan. In our state, if we have a student that is 2E, that has a special ed identification as well as gifted, they have a single IEP. So because learning support, special ed is a federal mandate, that supersedes, in our state at least, and in some other states as well, the gifted identification. So we embed the gifted goals, the gifted short-term objectives, the gifted supports within that IEP if they have a learning disability or some other special ed identification. So when we have a student like that, we work very closely with the learning support staff to make sure that we are getting everything into that IEP that student needs, to make sure that we're supporting them in every facet of their learning needs. For students that are not 2E, that do not have a learning disability or other special ed identification, we still have a GIEP. And it's a fairly standard approach, I think, across multiple states, but we look at their present levels of educational performance. So how are they performing? Because we can't identify goals until we know where they are in the curriculum. And so we look at what their present levels are, and then we build their goals off of that, working with the student, working with the parents. It's very much a team approach, working with the regular ed teachers in trying to tailor the support services that we have to better meet their needs, both in the regular ed classroom as well as outside, depending on the services that are provided in that particular school or district.
So parents could look up in their states to see whether a GIEP is available to their child in their state. And one of the things that you mentioned to me, and I think this is probably true of kids whether they're gifted or not, is the area of misdiagnosis. And sometimes my area of specialty is working with kids on a one-to-one basis who have academic issues that are causing misbehavior, or misbehavior that are causing academic issues, because it can go either way. Right. And what I have found, and please correct me if you think that I'm off base here, is that many of the kids who are diagnosed with ADHD, for example, or OCD, or any of the other alphabet soup diagnoses, and the diagnosis stopped there, and they are having academic problems. So I'm working with them to address this diagnosis of theirs with the parents and trying to support their needs in the classroom. And what I have found on 2 occasions is that these kids that I have worked with over the years on 2 occasions were extremely bright and sent the parents back to have them reevaluated from an intellectual component rather than the psychological component. And in their cases, what happened is that because they were so bright, and because the example that I gave you earlier was that the 20 minutes the teacher was spending going over a particular concept, this child got it at the beginning and then was bored to death and was acting out in class. So I know that was a long segue into this, but perhaps you can, has this been your experience? And if it has been your experience, how do you recommend that parents bring this up as a possibility if they feel that their child is intellectually gifted and that their diagnosis might be accurate but not complete?
I love how you ended that with accurate but not complete. That's an excellent way to look at it. Yeah, that is one of the challenges. And one of the challenges that we often come across is that the first identification, as you indicated, that's where we stop. And so whether it's a learning disability that's been diagnosed or the gifted identification, it often ends there. And so we don't take the next step, which is really looking at that holistic profile of the student. We think, okay, we've identified an issue. That's where we're going to stop and provide services. When we need to make sure that we do gather all the different data points, because that can be really telling about a student. And that's one of the reasons that, especially if students are identified early on, we start to see it as they reach intermediate, perhaps middle school, where the curriculum can be more challenging. So let's say, for example, we have a gifted learner, and I've seen this happen, who was identified early, and elementary school was easy for them. It's a very, often it's a very spiral curriculum where it builds on the prior year. So they're able to be successful academically. It isn't really a challenge. Often, and depending on the district, by middle school, the curriculum starts to differentiate a bit more. We start to give them a more challenging curriculum. And because school has been so easy for them in their early years, they haven't really developed the skill set or the organizational skills to be able to handle that increased rigor. For some students, it might take until high school. Some students, it may wait until college. But at some point, they hit that wall. And they've been able to really mask the other, let's say in this example, they've been able to mask that disability for a long time because of their intellect. And but at some point they hit that wall, and that's the point where we really need to make sure that we are doing a reevaluation and doing a holistic evaluation to see whether or not there is a learning disability that might be impacting their ability to be successful. And we have to make sure we're bringing parents into that discussion. And I think parents need to be part of that. It's a team, but too often the parents just sign off on the documents because parents don't know. They're busy, they aren't trained, they don't have necessarily all the information that really should be provided to them by the districts to really make an educated decision about that. So I've seen that happen. And I've also seen it too, where I've had students at the middle school level come, they were identified for learning support early on in their educational career. But at some point, I think a teacher recognized, or sometimes the parent as well, they recognize that this child has something. There's this spark that we're seeing, that there's this gleam in their eye. They've been able to take this idea or this concept or this project to a degree we never thought possible. And so we need to look beyond just what we expect in the classroom and really look for ways that we can potentially identify these students. And that's one of the reasons that we highly recommend universal screenings in schools, because if we always just base it on, especially just on teacher referrals, if teachers haven't been trained in what to look for example, looking for gifted learners, they're going to typically refer the teacher pleasers, the students that get high grades, the ones that are compliant. And as we know, those are not necessarily all the gifted students. They may not necessarily fit that particular profile. And so universal screeners are one way to try to, we screen every student and we look for outliers in that to see whether or not, this is a student that we might want to look a little more closely at. and look at their portfolio of work and see whether or not there are needs there that have gone previously unidentified.
You've actually given me a great segue. We have a few minutes left, and I think this would be a good time for you to continue in this vein, but address some of the specific ways that parents and teachers can work with these children or help their children. I wrote down some of them that you shared with me. We probably won't have time to go through all of them, but maybe we can post the rest of them up on the podcast. But one of the things you mentioned to me was, I'm going to pick out a couple, and you can go wherever you want,
Sure.
along the way, any road. But one of the things that you mentioned to me was that girls and boys sometimes have a different perspective on being gifted. That in itself, I think, could lead us down to how parents might talk to their children about being gifted, and how parents might talk to the teachers about their gifted child, and the concept of failure and
Excellent.
perfectionism. So those are some. I don't know what you have time for in the next few minutes, but let's see what we can get through.
Oh, those are great ones. Yeah, those are looking at how boys and girls differ. Obviously, these are generalities. There are always exceptions to the rule. But when we look at giftedness and how it's manifested between boys and girls, a lot of it does tend to fit the stereotypes. We have, the girls do tend to be more compliant in some respects. The boys do tend to be the ones that tend to dominate conversations sometimes, the ones that are raising their hand. And we see that in a lot of gender studies to begin with. But one of the challenges and one of the frustrations that I often would experience, and I'd mentioned, we talked before about academic competitions, and one of the way, and I could talk for an hour about the value of that, and I won't. But that's something that I think are so important for gifted learners. And because it was something I was very passionate about, it came to about middle school. We saw that gifted girls, and I'd mentioned before the idea of social suicide coming out of the movie Mean Girls, for example, for the pop culture reference there, and just how girls, it's not viewed nearly as positively for many girls in many contexts to be gifted, to be intelligent. And so we start to see sometimes that gifted girls, as they reach adolescence, tend to want to hide some of that. And which I think is horrible. It's a shame, because our students need to embrace who they are as learners. And we often see, when you look at popularity studies, gifted girls don't tend to be at the top of that. So girls sometimes start to hide some of that ability, and that's extremely unfortunate. So we need to work with girls, letting them know that that's who they are, and that's a wonderful part of them. And I think even more importantly is giving them opportunities to be successful, to show them that there's a tremendous amount of value to academic and intellectual success. And then related to that, you had mentioned the idea of failure. And that's one of my favorite things to work with my students. And I love to use the acronym FAIL, F-A-I-L, First Attempt in Learning. And it's kind of cheesy. And, they tell me that years later, they come back, I remember you talked about that. And you know what, that actually makes a lot of sense. And
I like that.
It's one that I like to use with them, because and it also, goes into my STEM and my science education. Failure is such an important part in the process of learning. If we don't fail, I really feel that we're not trying. And that to me is the worst kind of failure, is to not try. And so we talk about inventors. We talk about the struggles that they had. We talk about athletes. Michael Jordan is the typical one. He got cut from his basketball team and came back, and as we know, he's perhaps the greatest of all time in basketball. And we talk about how success it's not a linear progression. There's going to be setbacks. There's going to be times when you feel you can't move on, but you need to get up and keep trying. And that's a lesson that I love to teach to our kids. And unfortunately, many gifted learners don't experience failure when they're young, because school's too easy. So I try to tell teachers and parents, give your child an opportunity to be successful through a real challenge. they need to be able to develop that skill set to be able to overcome challenges when they finally face it. So let's give it to them when we're there to support them in, either assignments or our activities, things that they can do where they learn how it feels to struggle and to overcome that and to achieve real success. And that can be done through STEM activities, STEM challenges. It can be done through school assignments. It can be done through things at home. And I think too often we swoop in to try to rescue children when they're struggling, and I think that does them a real disservice. I think all students benefit from the struggle, being able to understand that feeling and then being able to overcome it. And for gifted learners in particular, because sometimes school comes so easily to them, that's a lesson that they don't learn. They unfortunately learn the lesson that school is easy, and that they don't have to work very hard to be successful. And I know I won't have time to talk about imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon.
I just looked at that and I just wrote that down.
But that comes out of that as well. That feeling that, oh my, I'm an imposter. I may not really be gifted because all my life it's been easy. Now I face a challenge. I don't know what that means. My identity is wrapped up in being gifted. Therefore, maybe I'm not really gifted. And that's really, really difficult for children.
That's scary.
Oh, it's
that can
very
be very
scary because
scary.
it goes to your fundamental identity of who you are.
Right.
And that's a terrible thing. So the more we can get kids to deal with this at a young age, when we're there to support them, we can be there for them, help them understand who they are, why they are the way that they are. I think it's so much better. And it just reminded me of a question that I do often get, and that is, should we talk with kids about being gifted? Is that important? And I think it really is, because as I think I've mentioned in prior conversations with you, if we don't tell kids what giftedness means, they're going to learn what giftedness looks like, and it may not be accurate, from their peers, from popular media, whatever. They may not understand what giftedness really means. It doesn't mean they're better. It doesn't mean that their needs are more important than anyone else's. It just means that's how they learn. And it doesn't mean there's something wrong with them. It just means that's how they are, that's who they are, and then we need to come alongside them and give them strategies to try to help them be successful. And I know one of yours, and I think one of the most important strategies that we can use, and something that you're passionate about, is the idea of mentoring students.
Yeah.
And having a mentor, whether it's an older child or an adult. For gifted learners, the research overwhelmingly supports the efficacy of that, is having them find somebody who has been through it, somebody who's doing what they think they could envision themselves doing someday down the road. And that adult or that older learner coming alongside them and helping them get to where they are is significant, and it's huge. So
that biology teacher for you was kind of like a mentor.
He was, yes.
Showed you what you were able to do that you really hadn't thought of before.
Exactly. Yes. That's a great example of that. My own personal learning situation. That was something that I felt was very valuable. Definitely. And, along those lines, I think we really need to help students try to figure out what it is that they are really passionate about. I'd mentioned that multi-potentiality, and that's something that in early elementary, students can do all kinds of things. In middle school and high school, one of the challenges that many of my students had was organization. Not because they were disorganized, which I was. That was an executive functioning skill I'm still working on. But a lot of our students, because they could see themselves doing so many things, they want to do everything. And I tell them, you can't. In secondary education, you start to need really to specialize in some areas to become really good at it, because you can't do everything. I know you want to do marching band, you want to do basketball, football, you want to do quiz bowl, you want to do all of these things. Those are all wonderful, but maybe some of those could be secondary hobbies, and you want to focus on a few areas to really help yourself to be successful, because they try so many things that it really ends up being a struggle in scheduling all of those things, which can be a challenge.
I think because there are so many different ways that parents and teachers can help students, I'm going to talk to you about putting together a document that we can have available to parents and teachers, which they can click on and get a full list and perhaps some ideas as to how they can help their student, because we just don't have time to go through all of them, and you have such wonderful ideas and experiences to share. I want to thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Wolfgang. This has been fun. I hope the people who are listening get to see that we had a great conversation, and you have so much to share. You're going to give me some links so that people can get in touch with you. Yes. And it will also be posted on my website, which is justeducationfirst.com. I have all the podcasts there. We're building a wonderful library on so many different topics that I hope our educators, our mentors will go and see if there's something that can give them a foundation, just a foundation of information and some direction so that they can move on from there. Everyone who has been on the show is so giving and so gracious and so knowledgeable that, and I know that they will open your eyes to the topic and give you some direction that will help you to make some choices that you need to make. These are not easy choices. Please get in touch with them. They are more than willing to help you. Thank you, everybody. Great. Have a wonderful day and come back next month. We have some really interesting individuals who are going to be talking about some new stuff. You'll have to wait and see some new stuff. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, mentors, for being with us today. If you found this podcast of value, please visit justeducationfirst.com to subscribe to our blog and mentorship and education podcast so that you may continue the exploration with us. Our goal is to provide a free treasury of information for our listeners so they can become acquainted with the amazing resources that we have available to us. We want to thank all of our guests for giving their time and sharing their wealth of information with us. Please also visit their websites and explore more of their resources to further your pursuit of the topic. Hope to hear from you at justeducationfirst.com. Have a good week, and thank you.